every civilization on record has died twice, and the second death is the one that gets the date. Why did the Roman Empire write 192 separate laws to force its wealthiest men to accept an honour their grandfathers had bribed people to obtain? Why did the King of France stop curing the sick with his bare hands in 1739 and never do it again? Why did the Soviet Union classify its own infant mortality statistics for 13 years? And why does a carved stone at a small Maya town, dated to 889, have no king on it, when the one standing beside it does? 4 questions. 1600 years apart, on 3 continents, in societies with nothing in common. They have the same answer, and that answer is considerably worse than any of them looks on its own, because the moment you can see what those 4 things are, you can run the same test on the country you are sitting in tonight, using numbers that are published every year and that almost nobody reads correctly. Get comfortable. Stay to the end, because you will leave understanding why asking whether your society is going to collapse is the wrong question entirely. If you want these without ads, that lives over on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which this channel is part of. Ad-free episodes from every channel in the group, plus early access before anything goes public. Subscribe or join if you haven't. Let's ease into it. On the 12th of May, 1797, the oldest continuously functioning republic on the planet held a vote to abolish itself, and lost quorum while doing it. The Great Council of Venice met that morning in a room they had been meeting in for centuries. 537 men showed up. The rules required 600. They took the vote anyway. 512 voted to dissolve the Venetian Republic, hand the city to a 27-year-old Corsican artillery officer who had not fired a single shot at them, and end 1100 years of independent government. Then they went home. The Doge, Ludovico Manin, the 120th man to hold that office, went upstairs, took off the corno ducale, the horned linen cap that was the single most recognisable symbol of Venetian sovereignty in Europe, and handed it to his servant. The line he is supposed to have said as he did it has been repeated ever since. He would not be needing it again. Now here is the detail that should stop you. Venice was not defeated. There was no siege. There was no bombardment. The city sat inside a lagoon that had protected it from every land army in European history, including the Ottomans at the height of their power. It had a navy. Not a great one by then, but it existed. It had money. It had walls of water that Napoleon's troops, who had no fleet in the Adriatic worth the name, could not simply walk across. Military historians who have gone back over the correspondence broadly agree that Venice could have held. Not forever, but long enough to negotiate, long enough to make itself expensive, long enough to matter. Nobody wanted to. Not the council, not the navy, not the guilds, not the arsenal workers, who had historically been the most fiercely loyal population in the city. The men who built the fleet and rioted when they thought the Republic was being insulted. When the vote came, the Republic could not find anyone who would die for it. 4 days later, 4,000 French soldiers walked into St. Mark's Square without resistance, and the council that had voted itself out of existence was already dispersing into the private lives it had apparently been living all along. 1100 years. One morning. No battle. And the question that historians have been circling ever since is not how Venice fell in 1797. The question is when Venice actually died, because it clearly was not that Friday. Something had already happened. Something had already gone. The vote was not an execution. It was a death certificate signed late, by clerks, for a body that had been cooling for a long time and that nobody had thought to examine. This is the thing I want to put in front of you, and I want to be precise about it. because it is not a metaphor and it is not a mood. It is a claim about how states actually end, and it has a fairly large body of evidence behind it, and almost none of that evidence is in the version of history you got. Civilizations die twice. The second death is the one that gets the date. The barbarians in the Forum, the flag coming down, the last emperor deposed, the tanks in the square. That death is loud and visual, and it fits on a timeline, which is why it is the one that ends up in the textbook. But it is a lagging indicator. It is the moment the paperwork catches up. The first death is different. The first death is the moment the thing stops being believed in, not stops working, not stops collecting taxes or issuing coins or holding elections or staffing its offices. All of that can continue, and historically it usually does continue, sometimes for decades, in one case for the better part of a century. What ends is something less visible and much more load-bearing. People stop showing up for it voluntarily. Elites stop rooting their ambitions through it. Citizens stop treating its demands as legitimate and start treating them as weather, as something to be endured or evaded rather than obeyed. And crucially, when the moment comes, nobody will fight for it. The first death has no date in the textbook because it does not look like anything. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday. It looks like people going to work, filing paperwork, complaining about prices, watching entertainment, planning holidays. That is what it looked like in Venice in 1760. That is what it looked like in Roman Gaul in the year 400. That is what it looked like in Moscow in 1978. The people living through the first death do not experience it as a death. They experience it as normal life. And that is the problem. That is the entire problem, and it is the thing I have not been able to put down since I started reading into this, because it points somewhere extremely uncomfortable. If the first death is invisible from the inside, and the second death is just the lagging paperwork, then the only honest question you can ask about your own society is not whether it is going to collapse. The question is whether the first death has already happened, and you are currently living in the part that comes after. I want to walk you through what the evidence actually looks like, because there is a lot more of it than you would expect, and because the historians who work on this have developed something close to a diagnostic toolkit, a set of instruments for dating the invisible death. Tax compliance records, employment law, the circulation figures of pornography, the number of people a king touched with his hands in a given year, infant mortality data that a superpower classified for 13 years because of what it showed, and the single most reliable signature of all, which shows up in Rome and in Bourbon, France, and in the late Soviet Union, and which I am going to hold back until the end, because once you know what it is, you will start seeing it, and I want you to see the rest of the case first. Here is what I will tell you now. Every one of these societies eventually started writing a particular kind of law, the same kind of law, and that law is the death certificate written in advance by people who did not know that is what they were writing. But before any of that, I have to introduce you to the man who worked this out first, roughly 600 years ago, in a fortress in the Algerian highlands, while hiding from a political career that had already tried to kill him twice. His name was Ibn Khaldun, and Western historians ignored him for 400 years. He was born in Tunis on the 27th of May, 1332, into a family that had done rather well out of the collapse of somewhere else. The Khalduns were Arabs of Yemeni descent who had settled in Seville during the centuries when Seville was a Muslim city, and had accumulated the kind of position that families accumulate over generations, offices and property, and the assumption of continuity. Then the Christian Reconquest came and took Seville, and the family did what families do, which is pack what they can carry and go somewhere the collapse has not reached yet. They went to North Africa. Young Ibn Khaldun therefore grew up inside a household whose entire self-understanding was organised around a civilization that had ended. Then, when he was 16, the Black Death arrived. The plague reached Tunis in 1348. It killed both of his parents. It killed most of his teachers, the intellectual world he had been raised to enter. The network of scholars and jurists who transmitted knowledge from one generation to the next was cut apart in a single season. He wrote about it later, decades later, and what is striking is that he does not write about it as personal grief. He writes about it as a structural event. He says civilization itself was diminished, that the whole inhabited world changed, that it was as if the voice of existence had called out for oblivion and the world had answered. A boy who watched his family and his teachers die in the space of a few months, and who had been raised on stories of a great city his people had already lost once, grew into the man who asked the question nobody else was asking. Not why do dynasties fall? Everyone asked that. The moralists had a perfectly good answer, which was that rulers became wicked and God punished them, and that answer had the advantage of being unfalsifiable and the disadvantage of being useless. Ibn Khaldun asked a different question. He asked why they fall on a schedule. His own political career gave him a great deal of material to think with. He spent roughly 2 decades as a working politician and diplomat across North Africa and Muslim Spain, moving between the courts of Tunis, Fez, Granada and Bijaya, and the pattern of that career is almost comically consistent. He would arrive somewhere, be recognised as brilliant, be given a serious office, become entangled in a factional dispute he had not started, and then be imprisoned, exiled, or quietly informed that the climate elsewhere would suit him better. He was jailed for close to 2 years in Fez on suspicion of plotting. He was sent by the Sultan of Granada on a diplomatic mission to Pedro the Cruel of Castile in 1364, and Pedro, who had a certain eye for talent, offered him a job. He turned it down. He kept going back into the machine. By 1375 he had had enough. He wrote later that he was craving solitude from what he called the exhausting business of politics, which is a sentence that lands the same way in any century. He took his family and went to the protection of a Berber tribe, the Awlad Arif, who put him up in a fortress called Khalat ibn Salama in the highlands near what is now Frenda in western Algeria. And there, cut off from courts and factions and the constant low-grade threat of assassination, he sat down and wrote what he called the Muqaddimah, the introduction, in 5 months. He finished the first draft in 1377. He was 45 years old. It is, by a considerable margin, the strangest book of the 14th century, because it is not a history. It is a theory of what history is made of. He is explicitly trying to build a new science, and he says so, and he is not being modest about it. He argues that human social organisation has laws in the same way the natural world has laws, that those laws can be derived from evidence, and that any historical account which violates them can be rejected as false, regardless of how many respectable sources repeat it. He then spends a large portion of the book doing exactly that, going through received historical accounts and demolishing them on the grounds that the numbers do not work, that the logistics are impossible, that no army of that size could have been fed in that terrain. 6 centuries before the discipline existed, a man in an Algerian fortress was doing source criticism because he was annoyed that everyone else was lazy. But the part that matters here, the part that is the reason we are having this conversation at all, is his answer to why dynasties die on a schedule. And his answer is a single word that has no clean English equivalent. Asabiyyah, the usual translations are group feeling, social cohesion, solidarity, esprit de corps. None of them are quite right, because all of them sound like a pleasant quality a society might have, a sort of civic warmth, and that is not what he means. He means something closer to load-bearing capacity. Asabiyyah is the thing that makes a group of people willing to act as one body under pressure. It is what makes a man fight for people he is not related to. It is what makes someone accept a cost now for a benefit that will land on someone else later. It is the reason a tax gets paid when nobody is watching, the reason an office gets staffed by someone who could be doing better elsewhere, the reason a line gets held, and Ibn Khaldun's central claim, the one that got him ignored and then rediscovered and then argued about for 150 years, is that Asabiyyah is manufactured by hardship and destroyed by success. His model runs like this. A group living under harsh conditions, in his case desert or mountain tribes, develops extremely high cohesion because it has no choice. Scarcity and danger make mutual reliance non-optional. That cohesion is a weapon. It allows a small group to overwhelm a much larger, wealthier, better equipped settled society, because the settled society has traded its cohesion for comfort and no longer has anyone who will hold a line for free. The hard group takes the palace. And then the clock starts. The founding generation knows exactly what it cost, because they paid it. The second generation grew up around men who paid it, and imitates them well enough. The third generation has only heard about it. They inherit the position, the wealth, the manners, and none of the conditions that produced any of it. By the fourth generation, you have a ruling elite that regards the whole structure as a natural feature of the universe, like weather, and cannot conceive that it was ever built by anyone, let alone that it needs maintaining. Roughly 3 generations, roughly 120 years, because he took 40 years as the span of a generation and multiplied. And here is where his model gets genuinely uncomfortable, and where it stops being a quaint medieval cycle theory and starts being a diagnostic. Because he does not say the dynasty falls when the fourth generation is overthrown. He says the dynasty is already finished before anyone touches it. The Asabiyyah is gone by then. What remains is an apparatus, staffed by people who have no group feeling for it, funded by taxes that have to be raised higher and higher precisely because voluntary compliance has evaporated, defended by mercenaries because the ruling group no longer contains anyone who will fight. He specifically identifies the mercenary transition as a symptom. When a ruling group has to pay strangers to defend it, the thing that made it a group has already died. He is describing the first death, in 1377, and he is describing the second death as an almost trivial afterthought, a formality that occurs whenever some hard group from the periphery notices that the palace is unguarded and walks in. Read the vote in Venice again with that in your hand. 537 men who could not be bothered to fill a quorum, handing over 1100 years to a foreign army they had not fought, in a city whose defenders had stopped existing decades earlier. Ibn Khaldun would not have found that remarkable in the slightest. He would have asked what year the Asabiyyah went, and he would have expected the answer to be a long way before 1797. Now there are real problems with his model, and I am not going to smooth them over, because the version of this argument that skips the objections is the version that gets torn apart in the comments and deserves to be. The first problem is that the 120-year clock does not hold. It is not even close to holding. The Ottomans ran for 6 centuries. The Roman Republic and Empire together ran for something like 1,000 years depending on where you start counting. Venice managed 1100. Khaldun himself knew this and hedged, arguing that dynasties with strong religious motivation or unusual adaptive capacity could extend the cycle, which is the kind of hedge that starts to make a theory unfalsifiable if you let it. The second problem is that his model was built from one specific historical environment, the Maghreb, where a settled coastal civilization sat next to a tribal hinterland that periodically conquered it. That is a real pattern, and he described it beautifully. Whether it generalizes to societies with no tribal periphery is a genuinely open question. and a lot of serious scholars think it does not. The third problem is the one I find hardest to dismiss. His model is much better at explaining collapses that have already happened than at identifying one in progress. Any society, at any moment, contains elites who are softer than their grandfathers and citizens who complain about taxes. You can always tell the Asabiyyah story afterwards. Telling it in advance, with a date on it, is a completely different exercise. And the track record of people who have tried is not good. Hold that objection. I am going to come back to it, and when I do it is going to be worse than it currently looks. Because here is what happened to Ibn Khaldun's work, and it is the first appearance of a pattern that runs through this entire story. He finished the Muqaddimah in 1377. He went back into public life, moved to Mamluk Cairo in 1382, taught at Al-Azhar, and was appointed chief Maliki judge, an office he was dismissed from and reappointed to repeatedly because he kept trying to enforce the law against people who were used to being exempt from it. While he was in Egypt, the ship carrying his wife and children to join him went down. He lost his family a second time, in a single event, the way he had lost them the first time. In 1399, Timur, the man Europe called Tamerlane, came west. In 1399 and 1400 he took Aleppo and then moved on Damascus, and Ibn Khaldun was in the city. When Damascus was besieged in 1401, and the Egyptian Sultan slipped away and left the population to negotiate, Ibn Khaldun had himself lowered over the city wall by rope to meet the man who had just burned half of Asia. They talked for weeks. Timur asked him about the geography of North Africa and about the Maghreb, and Ibn Khaldun, who was almost 70 and had spent his life studying exactly this, sat in the tent of a conqueror and explained the anatomy of conquest to him. He wrote up the meeting afterwards. It is one of the few first-hand accounts of Timur by someone who was not either terrified into flattery or writing propaganda. He died in Cairo on the 17th of March, 1406. And then, essentially, nothing happened for 400 years. The Muqaddimah was read in the Ottoman world. It was not read in Europe. There was no Latin translation, no engagement, no argument. The men who built the Western tradition of historical thought, the ones who were taught to you as the origin of the discipline, were doing their work in complete ignorance of a book that had already anticipated large parts of it. It was not until the 1800s that European Orientalists, mostly French and Austrian, pulled the text out and began translating it, and the reaction was something close to embarrassment. Arnold Toynbee, who had a fairly high opinion of his own field and of himself, called the Muqaddimah undoubtedly the greatest work of its kind ever created by any mind in any time or place. 400 years, sitting there in a language European scholars could read if they chose to learn it, describing the mechanism by which their own states would eventually fail. That is the first time in this story that the information was available and nobody looked. It is not the last. It is not even the worst, because the best documented case of a civilization dying twice is not Venice, and it is not a Maghrebi dynasty. It is the one you already think you know the date of, and the date you know is wrong by about a century, and the evidence that it is wrong has been sitting in a legal code that any classics undergraduate can read since the 5th century. The Theodosian Code was published in Constantinople on the 15th of February, 438, and extended to the Western Empire the following year. It is a compilation of imperial law going back to Constantine, organised by subject, and it is one of the most valuable documents in the entire history of the ancient world. Because unlike a chronicle, it is not trying to persuade you of anything. It is administrative. It is a state talking to itself about problems it is actually having. Inside it, there is a section on decurions. The decurions were the town councillors. every city in the Roman world had a curia, a council, and the men who sat on it were the local landowning class, the people who ran the place. This was not a burden in the early empire. It was the point of being wealthy in a provincial town. The curial class competed for the honour, and the physical evidence of that competition is still standing. If you have ever walked through the ruins at Ephesus or Miletus or Leptis Magna and wondered who paid for the theatres and the aqueducts and the colonnaded streets and towns you had never heard of, that is who. Local men, showing off, buying immortality in stone, because membership of the council was the thing that made you somebody. The section on decurions in the Theodosian Code contains 192 separate laws, dated between 315 and 436. It is the longest single chapter in the code. And nearly all of those laws exist for one purpose. They are trying to stop decurions from running away. They forbid decurions from leaving their towns. They forbid them from entering the imperial civil service, which was the obvious escape route. They forbid them from joining the army. They forbid them from entering the clergy. Then they carve out exceptions. Then they close the exceptions. They forbid them from moving to the countryside. They order provincial governors to hunt down men who have fled their curia and drag them back. They make the obligation hereditary, so that a man's sons inherit the position whether they want it or not. They rule on what happens when a decurion's daughter marries a man of another class, because that was being used as a loophole. They rule on decurions who have deliberately impoverished themselves to become ineligible. They rule on decurions who have run away and joined the barbarians. 192 laws, over 121 years, to force the wealthiest and most prominent men in every town in the Roman world to accept and honour their great-grandfathers had bribed people to obtain. I want you to sit with the shape of that document for a second, because it is not a chronicle written by a moralist with an axe to grind, and it is not archaeology that has to be interpreted. It is the Roman state, in its own voice on the record, telling us that its local governing class was fleeing into the woods to avoid governing. That is not a functioning empire with a tax problem. That is an obituary written in the passive voice. Why were they running? The mechanism is not complicated, and it is one of the more elegant pieces of self-destruction in administrative history. The imperial state, from the 3rd century crisis onward, needed vastly more revenue than it had previously needed, because it was fighting on multiple frontiers and paying an army that had learned it could set its own price. Rather than build a large central tax bureaucracy, which is expensive and slow, the empire made the decurions personally liable for their town's assessment. The council was assigned a number. If the town could not produce the number, the councillors made up the difference out of their own estates, which is fine when the assessment is modest and the harvest is good. It is a catastrophe when the assessment keeps climbing and your neighbours are getting poorer, because you are now personally financing the shortfall of an entire district every year, forever, and your children will inherit the obligation. The honour of running your town became a hereditary financial death sentence, and the men trapped in it did the obvious thing. They fled to the imperial bureaucracy, which was exempt. They fled to the church, which was exempt. They fled to the army. They gave their land to a great senatorial landowner and became his dependent, which was a status downgrade that nobody would have accepted a century earlier, and which was now preferable. And some of them, according to the laws themselves, simply went over to the barbarians. Now stop and consider what that means about belief. These are not peasants. These are the local elite. These are the people who benefit most from the Roman order, whose status and wealth and identity are constituted by it, who have Latin educations and Roman names and virs with mosaic flaws. And by the 4th and 5th centuries, a large enough number of them are running away from their civic obligations that the imperial government has to write 192 laws about it. The Roman elite had stopped believing the Roman state was worth participating in. Not stopped benefiting from it, stopped participating in it. Ibn Khaldun's Asabiyyah is not a mystical quality. This is what its absence looks like on paper. Therefore, the obvious question is when this happened, and here the evidence gets sharper and considerably more disturbing, because we have a witness. Around the 440s, a priest in Marseille named Salvian wrote a book called On the Government of God. Salvian was a refugee. He was from the Rhineland, from Trier probably, a city that was sacked repeatedly in his lifetime, and he had watched the world he grew up in come apart at close range. The book is nominally a theological argument. Christians were being blamed for the empire's disasters, and Salvian's answer is that the disasters are deserved, and that the Romans have earned every single thing that is happening to them. That framing is why the book survived, it is not why it matters. It matters because in the middle of the theology, Salvian starts reporting what he can see, and what he reports is that Romans are defecting. He says they are fleeing to the Goths. He says they are fleeing to the Bagaudae, who were the peasant insurgents of Gaul and Spain, Roman citizens in armed revolt against Roman government, with outbreaks running from the late 3rd century right through to a rising led by a man named Eudoxius in 441 that had to be put down with Alan cavalry. He says people are fleeing to barbarian tribes everywhere in power, and he says they do not regret it. His line, and I am giving it to you close to how the standard translation renders it because the phrasing is the whole point, is that they prefer to live as free men under an outward form of captivity than as captives under the appearance of liberty. Then he says the thing that should have ended the argument about Roman decline 600 years before Gibbon picked up a pen. He says that the name of Roman citizen, which was once not only greatly valued but dearly bought, is now repudiated and fled from, and is almost considered a thing to be abhorred. Roman citizenship, the status that a provincial family would spend a generation's wealth to acquire, that Paul of Tarsus invoked to save his life, that was the single most desirable legal condition available to a human being in the Western world for 400 years. By the 440s, in the account of a man watching it happen, people are running away from it. That is the first death, being described in real time by someone standing inside the corpse. And Salvian is very clear about why. It is not the barbarians. He says the tax burden is confiscatory, that the strong shift their assessments onto the weak, that the courts are for sale, that the great landowners plunder their neighbours, and the state protects them when they do. The people fleeing are not fleeing Rome, the civilization. They are fleeing a specific extraction machine that has stopped offering them anything in return. Legitimacy is a transaction. It is not a feeling. When the transaction stops making sense, the feeling goes with it, and once the feeling is gone, the apparatus has to be operated by force, which is expensive, which requires more extraction, which accelerates the thing it is trying to stop. Now here is where I have to correct something you were probably given at school, because it is the most consequential wrong date in European history, and it survives entirely on momentum. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in 476. What happened in 476 is that a Germanic officer in the Roman army named Odoacer, whose troops wanted land grants in Italy that the government could no longer pay for in cash, deposed a teenage figurehead emperor called Romulus Augustulus on the 4th of September. He did not kill him. He pensioned him off to a villa in Campania with an allowance. Then, Odoacer did something that tells you exactly how much had actually changed. He declined to appoint a new Western emperor, sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, and asked the Eastern emperor to recognize him as ruling Italy on the empire's behalf. And then, everything carried on. The Roman Senate continued to meet in the Curia. Consuls continued to be appointed, with the names recorded in the standard lists, for decades. Roman law continued to be the law of Italy. The tax system continued. The grain distribution continued. The aristocratic families continued to hold their estates and their offices and their dinner parties. Odoacer, and then Theoderic the Ostrogoth after him, ran Italy through the existing Roman administrative machine, staffed by Roman officials, because that machine still worked and there was no reason to break it. There are contemporary sources that do not mention 476 at all. Not because they were suppressing it, because from inside it did not register as an event. An unimpressive boy who had held a hollow title for 10 months was retired by the general who was actually running things, which had happened repeatedly over the previous 50 years, and the only structural difference was that this time nobody bothered to find a replacement boy. The date 476 is a later invention, assembled by historians who needed a line on a chart. It has almost nothing to do with what the people alive at the time experienced. But that raises the obvious problem, and this is the point where the argument about Rome has been stuck for about a century. If nothing happened in 476, did anything happen at all? There is a serious school of thought that says, essentially no. Peter Brown's work from the 1970s reframed the whole period as late antiquity, a long transformation rather than a fall, in which classical civilization mutated into something else, without ever dying. Henri Pirenne had argued decades earlier that the real rupture came much later with the Arab conquests closing the Mediterranean. On this reading The Fall of Rome is a story Europeans told themselves, and the reality was continuity with a change of management. And then Brian Ward-Perkins published a book in 2005 called The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, and it is one of the more brutal pieces of academic argument I have read, because he does not argue about interpretation. He goes and looks at the rubbish. His method is to ignore what people wrote and measure what they had. Pottery in particular. The Roman world produced standardized, wheel-thrown, kiln-fired pottery in numbers that are difficult to comprehend. There is a hill in Rome, Monte Testaccio, that is not a hill. It is an artificial mound made of an estimated 53 million broken amphorae. Discarded oil containers, stacked up over roughly 250 years. That is one dump, in one city, for one commodity. Roman pottery was cheap, consistent, and available to ordinary people across an entire continent, which means there was an economy capable of mass production, quality control, and long-distance distribution to people who were not rich. After the 5th century in the West, that disappears, not declines. Disappears, the quality collapses, the wheel goes out of use in some regions, distribution networks shrink to a few miles, and in parts of Britain the ceramic industry regresses to a standard below what existed before the Romans arrived. It does not recover for centuries. He does the same thing with roofing. Roman buildings, including quite ordinary ones, had fired clay tile roofs. Tile requires kilns, fuel, transport, and a market. After the collapse, tile manufacture essentially ceases across much of the West, and for something like 1,000 years the overwhelming majority of Europeans lived under thatch. He does it with cattle bones, which shrink after the Roman period and do not return to Roman size until around the 1300s. He does it with literacy, which contracts from something reasonably widespread, evidenced by graffiti scratched by ordinary people on ordinary walls, to a specialist skill held by clergy. And then there is the piece of evidence that I find genuinely unnerving, because it was not produced by any human being with an opinion. Ice cores from Greenland preserve atmospheric lead pollution, and lead pollution is a direct proxy for silver smelting, which is a direct proxy for coin production and economic activity. The Roman signal in Greenland ice is enormous. It peaks around the 1st century and it is not matched again until the 16 and 1700s. 16 centuries. A frozen record on the other side of the planet, laid down annually, showing an economy that fell so far it took the better part of 2,000 years to climb back. Ward-Perkins is right, and the Transformation School is also right. And the reason they can both be right is the two-death model. The institutional death was slow, gradual, and largely invisible, exactly as the continuity historians describe. The material death was fast, catastrophic and total, exactly as Ward-Perkins measures. They are not competing accounts of one event. They are the two deaths, and they are separated by about a century. Which brings us to the men who are standing in the gap between them, and to the single best illustration of what elite defection actually looks like from the inside. His name was Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, and he was, by any reasonable measure, the last great mind of the Roman world. Boethius was born around 480 into the Anici, one of the oldest and grandest senatorial families in Italy, a family that had been supplying consuls to Rome for generations. He was orphaned young and raised by another aristocrat, Symmachus, whose daughter he married. He was a serious philosopher, arguably the last person in the West for 600 years who could read Greek philosophy properly. And he had set himself the project of translating and reconciling the whole of Plato and Aristotle into Latin, because he could see that the knowledge of Greek was going, and that if somebody did not get it into Latin, it would be lost. He was right about that. He did not finish. He was consul in 510. In 522, in what must have been the proudest day of his life, his two sons were made joint consuls in the same year, and the man who appointed them was a Goth. Theodoric the Great ruled Italy from Ravenna as an Arian Christian Gothic king, who was, technically, holding the peninsula on behalf of the emperor in Constantinople. He ran the country using the Roman civil service. Boethius served him as Magister Officiorum, Master of Offices, which was one of the highest positions in the administration. His colleague Cassiodorus, another Roman aristocrat, spent decades in Theodoric's service and compiled hundreds of the king's official letters into a collection called the Varii, which is essentially a portfolio of a Roman gentleman's career written for a Gothic employer. That is the moment I want you to look at. Not 476. This, the most distinguished Roman families in Italy, holding the most senior offices available, drawing salaries and status and consulships from a barbarian king, not under duress, not as collaborators in an occupied country, as a career. Because by the early 6th century, the sensible, ambitious Roman aristocrat understood that the path to power ran through Ravenna and a Gothic court, and that the emperor was a long way away and not coming. That is what elite defection actually looks like. It does not look like betrayal. It looks like a promotion. And Boethius, of course, was destroyed by it. In 523, a senator named Albinus was accused of treasonous correspondence with Constantinople. Boethius defended him, reportedly saying that if Albinus was guilty then, so was he and so was the whole Senate, which was true and was exactly the wrong thing to say to a Gothic king who was becoming convinced that his Roman elite were plotting to bring the Eastern Empire back. Boethius was arrested. He was accused of treason and, in a detail that tells you something about the intellectual climate, of practicing magic. His accusers were not Goths. They were Romans. Basilius, Apilio, Gaudentius, the Roman aristocracy was eating itself inside a barbarian court. He was imprisoned near Pavia and executed in 524, by some accounts beaten to death. His father-in-law Symmachus was executed shortly after. In the cell, waiting, he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, a dialogue between himself and a personified philosophy about fortune, justice, and whether a good man can be destroyed by an unjust world. It became one of the most widely read books in medieval Europe. Alfred the Great translated it. Chaucer translated it. Elizabeth I translated it. For 1,000 years, the most influential text on how to face catastrophe was written by a Roman consul in a Gothic prison, waiting to be killed by the state he had spent his life administering. The last great Roman mind died as a political prisoner of a government that was still using Roman law to convict him. That is the gap between the two deaths. Boethius is executed in 524-40, 8 years after the empire supposedly ended, in a Latin-speaking Italy running on Roman institutions, and the thing that killed him was the paranoia of a regime that knew its elite's loyalty was for sale because it had bought it. Therefore, when exactly did Rome die? Watch what happens when you actually try to answer that, because this is the pattern that runs through every case in this story, and it is the reason I cannot let it go. Start at 476. Examine it. Nothing happened. The date is administrative fiction. Move back. Try 439, when the Vandals took Carthage and the Western Empire lost North Africa, which was its richest tax base and the source of the grain that fed Italy. That is a real event with real consequences. Within a few decades, the Western government could not pay its soldiers, which is precisely why Odoacer's men wanted land instead of money. But the empire had already been unable to control its own generals for decades before that. Move back. Try the 440s, Salvian, citizens fleeing to the barbarians. But Salvian is describing a process that is clearly well advanced by the time he writes it up. Move back. Try 410 and the sack of Rome by Alaric, the event that so shattered the Roman world that Jerome, in Bethlehem, wrote that the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. And Augustine spent the next 13 years writing The City of God to explain it. Enormous psychological event. But Alaric was a Roman general with a Roman army title trying to negotiate a supply contract, and he sacked the city because the government would not deal with him. Move back. Try 378 and the disaster at Adrianople, where an emperor and 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army were destroyed by Goths in an afternoon. Move back. Try the 3rd century crisis, when the empire nearly disintegrated, the currency was debased to worthlessness, and the compulsion state was invented, the whole apparatus of binding men to their fathers' occupations and their towns and their land, which is where the 192 laws come from. Every time you interrogate a candidate date, it dissolves into something earlier. The death recedes. It keeps receding. You can push it back as far as you like and there is always an antecedent, and eventually you are standing in the 2nd century arguing about tax farming and wondering how you got there. That is not a failure of the historians. That is the shape of the thing. The first death is not an event. It is a process with no clean edge, which is precisely why it is invisible from inside, because there is never a day on which it happens. But there is a moment when it becomes irreversible, and the reason I keep returning to those 192 laws is that they are the closest thing we have to a marker for it. Compulsion is not a cause. Compulsion is a symptom, and it is a late one. By the time a state is legislating to force its own elite to accept honours, the belief that made the honour desirable is already gone, and no amount of law can put it back. Hold that. You are going to see it again, in 2 more places, and the second of those is inside living memory. Because the same signature shows up in a country that had no barbarians, no plague, no invasion, and no fiscal collapse worth the name, and that went from the most secure monarchy in Europe to regicide in under a decade. and the instrument that lets us date its first death is a man putting his hands on a stranger's neck. For roughly 800 years, the kings of France cured disease by touching people. The condition was scrofula, a tubercular infection of the lymph nodes in the neck that produces visible swellings and open sores. It was called the King's Evil and the Claim. Made openly and institutionally, and as a formal part of the coronation liturgy, was that the anointed King of France possessed a thaumaturgic power transmitted through his hands. Sufferers were assembled, sometimes in the hundreds and sometimes in the thousands. The king walked the line, touched each face or neck, and said a formula. Le roi te touche, Dieu te guérisse. The king touches you, God heals you. This is not folklore that historians have reconstructed from peasant rumours. This was state ceremony, with attendance records performed by Louis XIV at Versailles in front of the entire court. And it is the single best measuring instrument for legitimacy decay that exists anywhere in the historical record, because, unlike belief, which you cannot measure, the royal touch produces a number. Somebody counted how many people showed up. Louis XIV touched in the thousands. The ceremony was attached to the great feast days, and on major occasions the crowds ran to well over 1,000 sufferers in a single session. People who had travelled from across France and beyond because they believed, actually believed, that the hands of this specific man could heal them. His great-grandson Louis XV inherited the practice. And then, in 1739, he stopped. The mechanism is almost too neat. The touch required the king to be in a state of grace, which required him to have taken communion, which required him to be free of unabsolved mortal sin. Louis XV had a mistress and would not give her up, so the church would not give him communion, so he could not touch. At Easter 1739 he did not appear, and the sufferers who had gathered were sent away. He never touched again. For 36 years the sacred healing power of the French monarchy simply did not operate, because the king preferred not to end an affair. Now think about what that does, not to the theology, to the story. For 8 centuries the monarchy had claimed a supernatural mandate, and had backed the claim with a public, repeatable, physical demonstration. Then, in front of everyone, the demonstration stopped, and the reason it stopped was that the sacred vessel of French kingship was sleeping with somebody. The claim was not refuted. It was quietly withdrawn on the grounds of the king's personal convenience, which is considerably worse, because a refuted claim can be argued with, and a withdrawn one just leaves an absence where the divine used to be. Louis XVI revived it at his coronation at Reims on the 11th of June 1775, and touched something in the region of 2,400 sufferers. That is a large number, and it looks like a restoration. It was not. Read the accounts, and what you find is that the crowd was assembled by administrators, that the ceremony was widely regarded as an antiquarian revival, and that educated opinion treated it as a charming survival rather than a working sacrament. Voltaire had already made the obvious joke decades earlier, observing that one of Louis XIV's mistresses had died of scrofula, despite being very well touched by the king. The last French monarch to perform the ritual was Charles X, at his coronation in 1825. He touched 121 people, from well over 1,000 to a 36-year suspension because of a mistress, to 2,400 as a staged revival, to 121 to never again. That is a graph. That is the desacralization of the French monarchy, plotted in units of human beings who were prepared to stand in a queue for it. Louis XIV subjects believed the king was a channel of divine power. Louis XVI subjects came to look at a costume. Therefore, when did the French monarchy die? The textbook answer is the 14th of July 1789 or the 21st of January 1793, when they cut Louis XVI's head off in the Place de la Révolution. Both of those are second deaths. Both of them are paperwork. Watch the date recede again. Go back to 1786 and the affair of the diamond necklace. The details are baroque, and I will keep them short. A confidence trickster named Jean de la Motte persuaded Cardinal de Rohan, a senior churchman who was desperate to get back into Marie Antoinette's favour, that the Queen secretly wanted to buy an absurd diamond necklace worth around 1.6 million livres and needed him to act as her intermediary. There were forged letters. There was a prostitute hired to impersonate the Queen in a nighttime meeting in the gardens of Versailles. Rohan handed over the necklace. It was broken up and the stones were sold in London. The Queen had nothing to do with any of it. She was, in the narrow legal sense, the victim. Rohan was tried by the Parliament of Paris, and on the 31st of May, 1786, he was acquitted. Read what that acquittal means. To acquit Rohan, the court had to accept that a cardinal of France could reasonably have believed that the Queen would secretly summon him at midnight to buy jewellery behind her husband's back. The verdict was not about Rohan. The verdict was a public finding that the story was credible, and everybody in Paris understood it that way. Then, Louis XVI exiled Rohan anyway, which the public read as the Crown punishing a man the courts had cleared, which converted a scandal into a demonstration of arbitrary power. The Queen was innocent, and it did not matter in the slightest. The reputation had already gone. There is a remark attributed to Napoleon, which I have not been able to trace to a firm primary source, and which you should therefore treat as legend rather than evidence, that the Queen's death should be dated from the diamond necklace trial. Legend or not, it is the correct diagnosis. But it recedes further. Go back to 1771 and the Maupeou coup, when Chancellor Maupeou, on the night of the 19th of January, had roughly 130 magistrates of the Parliament of Paris arrested in their homes by musketeers and exiled to the provinces, then abolished the venal offices and replaced the high courts with salaried appointees. He did it to break the Parliament's ability to obstruct royal taxation. In narrow terms, it worked. In every other sense, it was catastrophic, because it taught the entire French legal establishment, the most literate and articulate professional class in the country, that the monarchy regarded law as an obstacle. Louis XVI reversed it in 1774 to buy popularity, which taught everyone that royal policy could be reversed by pressure. Move back again. 1757, the Damiens affair. A domestic servant named Robert Francois Damiens pushed through the guards at Versailles on the 5th of January and stabbed Louis XV with a penknife. The wound was superficial. The king was back on his feet within days. Damiens was tortured for weeks and then, on the 28th of March, publicly executed in the Place de Grève by a method that had been reserved for regicide. His flesh was torn with pincers, molten lead and boiling oil were poured into the wounds, and he was pulled apart by horses, which took hours because the horses could not do it, and the executioners had to cut his tendons. It is the opening scene of Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and it is genuinely difficult to read. It was the last time it was ever done in France, and the contemporary accounts do not record a population satisfied by the vindication of sacred kingship. They record revulsion. Casanova, who watched it, wrote about the crowd and the horror of it. The disproportion was visible to everyone. A scratch answered with 4 hours of public dismemberment. A monarchy that had to make that much noise about its own inviolability was advertising that it no longer felt inviolable. Move back once more to 1739 to a king who could not perform his own central sacrament because he would not leave his mistress. 50 years before the Bastille. The date recedes exactly as it did for Rome. Every candidate dissolves into an antecedent. 1789 dissolves into 1786, which dissolves into 1771, which dissolves into 1757, which dissolves into 1739, and there is no flaw. And while it recedes, we have a second instrument, one that measures not what the state was doing, but what the population actually wanted to read. Robert Darnton spent years in the archives of the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, a Swiss publishing house that supplied the illegal French book trade. Because they were a business, they kept order books. Because they smuggled, their records show exactly which band titles booksellers in provincial France were ordering, in what quantities, year after year. It is as close as anyone will ever get to a bestseller list for pre-revolutionary France's underground. The result, published in 1995 as the forbidden bestsellers of pre-revolutionary France, is not what the standard story of the Enlightenment would predict. Rousseau's Social Contract, the text that the textbook version of the French Revolution is more or less built on, appears in the records with a single order. 1. What actually sold was a genre of the trade called philosophical books, which was a euphemism covering political slander, anti-clerical attacks and pornography, usually all three at once. The top of the list is dominated by titles like Anecdotes on the Countess du Barry, which is a filthy account of how a prostitute got into the king's bed and what she did there, and Therese the Philosopher, which is pornography with a philosophical frame, and works like The Year 2440, a utopian fantasy in which the narrator falls asleep and wakes in a future Paris, where the monarchy is a museum exhibit. The French reading public was not radicalized by political theory, it was radicalized by gossip about the Queen's genitals. And that is not a lesser thing, that is a more effective thing. You cannot argue a population out of believing in sacred monarchy with syllogisms, because sacred monarchy is not a proposition, it is an atmosphere. What destroys it is laughter. Every libel that put the king in a bedroom farce, every pamphlet that described Marie Antoinette as a foreign whore bankrupting France, chipped away at the one thing the whole structure depended on, which was the sense that these people were categorically different from you. By 1788, they were not categorically different. They were characters in a dirty book that everyone had read. Then the money ran out, and this is where the honest counter-argument lives. So let me put it as strongly as I can. France in the 1780s had a genuine fiscal emergency that had nothing to do with legitimacy. The intervention in the American War of Independence cost something in the order of 1.3 billion livres, financed almost entirely by borrowing, on top of debt left from the 7 Years' War. By 1788, servicing that debt was consuming roughly half of all state expenditure. That is not a metaphorical crisis. That is a state that cannot pay its bills. Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker running French finances, published the Compte Rendu au Roi in 1781, the first public account of royal finances in French history. It was a sensation. It reported an ordinary surplus of about 10 million livres. It achieved this by excluding the extraordinary account, which is where the war was. The real position was a substantial deficit, and Necker had raised somewhere around 520 million livres in loans in 4 years. He published a set of accounts that were technically defensible and functionally a lie, and hundreds of thousands of people read them and believed the state was solvent. When the truth emerged a few years later, the collapse of confidence was not just financial. If the accounts were fake, what else was? Then in 1787, the Crown convened an assembly of notables, a hand-picked body of the highest aristocracy and clergy, precisely because they were expected to be compliant, and asked them to approve a universal land tax that would apply to the nobility. They refused. That is the moment that should be in every textbook, and is not. Not the Bastille. This, the French elite, assembled by the king, chosen for loyalty. told the monarchy that it would not fund it and that new taxes would require the Estates General, a body that had not met since 1614. Ibn Khaldun would have needed about 4 seconds with that. When the ruling group will not pay for the state that constitutes it, the group feeling is gone. What is left is a set of individuals with private interests who happen to share a job title. The Stillman is this. Perhaps the fiscal crisis is the whole story. Perhaps the debt, plus a catastrophic hailstorm on the 13th of July 1788 that destroyed the harvest across a wide band of northern France, plus one of the coldest winters of the century, plus bread prices peaking in the exact week the Bastille fell, is sufficient. No mysterious legitimacy decay required, just money and weather. And Timothy Tackett's work makes that case harder to dismiss, because he went and read the letters and diaries of around 1,200 deputies to the Estates General, and what he found is that in 1789, the overwhelming majority of them were not revolutionaries. They were provincial lawyers and landowners who supported the king, wanted moderate reform, and would have been appalled to be told where this was going. Revolutionary ideology, in his account, is produced by the revolution rather than causing it. In 1788, essentially nobody in France wanted to abolish the monarchy. That is a serious objection, and I am not going to pretend it collapses under a clever line. But notice what it does not explain. It does not explain why, 4 years later, a country that had believed in sacred kingship for 800 years was able to execute its king and feel that it had done something legal. It does not explain why nobody defended him. Louis XVI went to the scaffold in a city of 600,000 people, and there was no rising, no rescue, no mass revulsion at the killing of the Lord's anointed, because by then the anointing had already been drained out of him. By a mistress in 1739, by a butchered servant in 1757, by 130 exiled judges in 1771, by a necklace in 1786, by a decade of pornography. The fiscal crisis was the second death. It arrived on time and killed a body that was already cold, and if you want to know whether that is a rhetorical flourish or a real claim, there is one more piece of the French record that settles it, and it is the same signature we saw in Rome appearing on schedule. In the last decades of the Ancien regime, as tax resistance mounted, the crown expanded the use of compulsion. Tax farming was intensified, collection was militarized, and the salt tax, the gabelle, was enforced by an armed corps with powers of search and arrest, generating tens of thousands of prosecutions a year and filling the galleys with smugglers. Whole regions were policed for revenue by men with guns. A state that has to garrison its own tax base has already lost the argument. It just has not been told yet. In 1974, the government of the Soviet Union classified its own mortality statistics, not military secrets, not weapons data, death records. The Central Statistical Administration stopped publishing detailed life expectancy figures and cause of death breakdowns. And the blackout held until 1987, 13 years in which the world's second superpower would not tell anyone, including its own citizens, how long its people were living. The reason is that the numbers had started going the wrong way. Soviet life expectancy peaked in the mid-1960s. Total life expectancy reached something close to 70 years around 1964, with male life expectancy at roughly 64.5. It had been one of the great genuine achievements of the system, a country that had gone from famine and civil war to something approaching Western longevity in 2 generations, and they were entitled to be proud of it. Then it reversed. Through the late 60s and the 70s, male life expectancy fell. By the early 80s it was down around 62.5. 2 full years lost in peacetime in an industrial country with universal healthcare and no war on its territory. There is no comparable case. industrial societies do not do that. Life expectancy in peacetime goes up, in every country, more or less continuously, punctuated only by war and epidemic. A superpower quietly losing 2 years of male life expectancy over a decade and a half is not a statistic. It is a diagnosis, and underneath it there was something worse. Infant mortality, which is the single most sensitive indicator of whether a society is functioning, started rising in the early 1970s. Not plateauing. Rising, Christopher Davis and Murray Feshbach documented it for the United States Census Bureau in a 1980 study that is still the standard reference, and the finding was that Soviet infant mortality had increased substantially over the previous decade, at a time when it was falling everywhere else in the developed world. Babies were dying at higher rates in 1975 than in 1965, in a country that had put a man in orbit 14 years earlier. That is the invisible scandal in this story, and it is worth being precise about what it means. The Soviet Union did not lie about these numbers, it simply stopped publishing them. Nobody was arrested. There was no directive announcing that the truth about Soviet mortality was forbidden. A statistical series just quietly ceased to appear, and everyone involved understood why, and nobody said anything for 13 years. That is what institutional self-deception actually looks like. Not conspiracy. Discretion, and here is where somebody was paying attention and got destroyed for it. Emmanuel Todd was a 25-year-old French demographer when he published a book called La Chute Finale in 1976. The Final Fall. His argument was that you could diagnose the Soviet system from its demographic data, and specifically from the rising infant mortality, because a state cannot fake that number in a way that survives scrutiny, and because it measures whether the basic machinery of a society, the hospitals and the supply chains and the sober attention of adults, is actually working. His conclusion was that the Soviet Union was in terminal structural decline and would come apart. He was widely dismissed, not refuted. Dismissed, he was young, he was working from published statistics rather than area expertise, and his conclusion was regarded as the sort of thing that could not be responsibly said. The Soviet Union collapsed 15 years later. He was not the first. 6 years earlier, in 1970, a Russian dissident named Andrei Amalrik had published an essay in the West called Will the Soviet Union Survive until 1984, and the title was a deliberate Orwell joke, and the argument was that the regime had become so isolated from its own society that it had lost the capacity to perceive reality, and that a system which cannot perceive reality cannot correct. He was sentenced to 3 years in a labour camp. At the end of it, they gave him another 3. He served part of it in Kolyma, in the far northeast, which was the worst place in the Soviet penal system. He was released in poor health, exiled from the country in 1976. And on the 12th of November 1980 he was killed in a car crash in Spain, aged 42, while driving to a human rights conference in Madrid held alongside the review of the Helsinki Accords. His wife and 2 other passengers in the car survived. He went through the windscreen. Years later, the distant Natan Sharansky recorded that his KGB interrogators had taunted him about it. Amalrik is dead, they said, and the Soviet Union is still standing. They were right for another 7 years. Now the question is how a state can be dead for a decade and a half and still standing, and the best answer anyone has produced comes from an anthropologist named Alexei Yurchak, who grew up in Leningrad and now teaches at Berkeley, and whose book Everything Was Forever, Until It Was No More, published in 2005, is the single most useful thing I have read on this entire subject. Yurchak starts from a paradox that anyone who lived through it will recognise. Before 1991, the Soviet system felt eternal, permanent, not in the sense that people liked it, but in the sense that it was the medium you lived in, like weather. And yet, when it disappeared, almost nobody was actually surprised. People described it afterwards as something they had somehow always known was coming. How can something feel both immutable and obviously doomed at the same time? His answer is a concept he calls hypernormalisation, and it is the key that unlocks the whole thing. From roughly the mid-1950s, Soviet official language became frozen. The formulations, the slogans, the structure of a party report, the phrasing of a resolution, all of it ossified into a fixed ritual form that could be reproduced but not altered, and crucially, not evaluated. It stopped functioning as a description of the world. It became a performance of allegiance. The words no longer had to be true, because truth was not what they were for, and everyone knew this. That is the part that matters. It was not that people were fooled. Party members, factory workers, students, Komsomol organisers, all of them participated correctly in the rituals, voted unanimously at meetings, marched on the correct days, produced the correct sentences, and simultaneously understood that none of it referred to anything. The ritual was maintained with enormous precision by people who had no belief in its content whatsoever. And in the space that opened up behind that performance, they built real lives. Yurchak's word for it is being vigné, outside or beside, and he describes an entire generation who were neither loyal nor dissident, but who lived in a kind of interior country that the official one had no vocabulary for. They had jobs in state institutions and spent the day doing nothing. They ran theatre groups and rock bands and archaeological clubs. They read whatever circulated. They were not opposing the system. They were living beside it, using its resources, ignoring its content. That is the first death, described from the inside by people who did not experience it as anything at all. Not oppression, not crisis. Ordinary life. And once you have that idea in your hand, the economic data stops being a list of failures and starts being a map of where the belief actually went. Gregory Grossman, an economist at Berkeley, published a paper in 1977 called The Second Economy of the USA that named the thing everyone in the Soviet Union already knew about and nobody had measured. Underneath the planned economy there was an enormous parallel economy of private production, theft from state enterprises, unofficial services, bribery and black market trade. His estimate, based on emigrant interviews and survey work, was that by the late 1970s private income accounted for somewhere between a quarter and a third of urban household income. A third of the money in Soviet cities was moving through a system the Soviet Union officially said did not exist. You could not get a car repaired without it. You could not get a decent cut of meat, a foreign book, a fashionable pair of shoes, a place at a good hospital, a plumber who would actually come. The official economy handled the ceremony of provision. The real one handled provision. And every transaction in that second economy was a small transfer of trust away from the state and into a network of personal obligation, which is exactly what Asabiyyah looks like when it drains out of an institution and reconstitutes itself somewhere smaller. The joke everyone quotes, that we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, is not a joke about laziness. It is a joke about a contract that both parties have privately cancelled while continuing to perform it in public. Therefore, the Soviet elite. This is the part that finishes the argument. Olga Krishtanovskaya and Stephen White published a study in Europe-Asia Studies in 1996 tracing where the Soviet nomenklatura ended up after the collapse. Their finding, based on survey work by the Russian Academy of Sciences, is that roughly 3/4 of Boris Yeltsin's inner circle, roughly 3/4 of the government, and around 60% of the parliamentary leadership came out of the old Soviet elite. For the new business elite, the emerging oligarchy, the estimates conflict. One 1994 survey put it at around 40%. Another study put it above 60%. The honest statement is that somewhere between 4 and 6 out of every 10 of the men who became rich in the wreckage had been party officials before it. Krishchanovskaya's phrase for 1991 is not revolution. She calls it the revolution of the second secretaries. The system did not fall to its enemies. It was converted into private property by its own managers, who had worked out, some years earlier, that the ideology was a costume and that the assets underneath it were real and could be taken. That is elite defection with a balance sheet. The Roman aristocrats took jobs from Theodoric. The French nobility refused to fund the crown. The Soviet Nomenklatura sold the state to itself, which is why nothing happened in August 1991. On the 19th of August, a committee of the most senior figures in the Soviet state, the Vice President, the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the Interior Minister, and the head of the KGB, announced that Gorbachev was ill and that they were taking over. They had the army, the security services, and the formal apparatus of the largest country on earth. They lasted 3 days. Not because they were defeated. There was no battle. Tanks came into Moscow and then sat there while crews argued with civilians, and some of them defected outright. A tank battalion officer from the Tamanskaya division named Sergei Yevdokimov brought his vehicles over to the Russian side, and it was on one of those tanks that Yeltsin stood outside the Parliament building at about 1 PM and read out his condemnation of the coup. The barricades around the White House were manned mostly by unarmed civilians. 3 of them died overnight on the 20th, when a column met an obstruction in a tunnel, and after those 3 deaths the armour pulled back and the coup dissolved. 3 deaths. That is what it cost to end the Soviet Union. The plotters never gave the order to storm the building, and the reason is fairly clear from the record, which is that they were not confident the order would be obeyed and could not survive finding out. A state whose leadership does not dare test the loyalty of its own troops is not a state that is losing, it is a state that already lost and is discovering the paperwork. Now the counter-evidence, and it is real, and anyone who has looked at this will already be shouting it. On the 17th of March 1991, 5 months before the coup and 9 months before the dissolution, the Soviet Union held the only nationwide referendum in its history. The question was whether citizens favoured preserving the Union as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics. Turnout was around 80%. The yes vote was 76.4% according to the official commission, which is around 113 million people. 6 republics boycotted, and their populations were a small fraction of the total. 113 million people voted to keep it, and it was gone before the end of the year. If legitimacy had already died, how do you explain that? I think the honest answer is that the referendum measured something real, and that the something was not legitimacy. It measured inertial preference. People voted for the continuation of the familiar, which is what people almost always vote for, and which tells you nothing about whether they would sacrifice anything to secure it. A vote is cheap. It costs a walk to a polling station. The relevant test of legitimacy is not what people say they would like to continue. It is what they will pay to keep, and what they will risk to defend. 5 months later that test was administered, and the answer came back with total clarity. Of 113 million people who had voted to preserve the Union, the number who came out to defend it when it was seized was approximately 0, and the number who came out against the men who seized it was in the tens of thousands. Inertial preference is not belief. It is the shape belief leaves behind, which holds until something touches it. And the signature is there too, right on schedule, in the same place it always is. In 1961, the Russian Republic passed a law against what it called parasitism, which made it a criminal offence for an adult to live without socially useful work. The most famous prosecution under it was the poet Joseph Brodsky, tried in Leningrad in 1964, whose exchange with the judge has survived because a journalist smuggled out a transcript. The judge asked who had enrolled him in the ranks of poets. Brodsky said he supposed it came from God. He was sentenced to 5 years of internal exile with hard labour. He later won the Nobel Prize in Literature. A state that legally compels its citizens to work is a state that has stopped expecting them to want to. And underneath that, the deeper one. Soviet citizens carried internal passports and needed a residence permit, a propiska, to live in a given city. Collective farm workers, tens of millions of them, were not issued internal passports at all for decades, which meant they could not legally leave the farm. That restriction was not fully lifted until the mid-1970s. Peasants bound to the land, unable to move, in the 20th century, in the workers' state. The Theodosian Code did exactly this with the colony in the 4th century, tying tenant farmers to the estates they worked and making the obligation hereditary. 1600 years apart, two collapsing systems reached for the identical instrument, for the identical reason, which is that people were leaving and the state could not make them want to stay. That is the second appearance of the signature. There is one more, and it is the one you are living in, but there is a case I need to put in front of you first, because it is the only one where you can watch the first death happen, decade by decade, in a medium that does not lie. The classic Maya kings called themselves Kuhol Ajal, Holy Lord, and the claim was not decorative. The king was the point of intersection between the world of people and the world of gods. He bled himself in public, drawing a stingray spine through his own tongue or genitals, so that the blood could feed the powers that made the maize grow. That was his function. That was what the pyramids were for, and to prove it, he put up stones. The stelae are the reason we can do this at all. A Maya king would erect a carved monument marking the end of a Khaldun, a period of just under 20 years, showing himself in ritual costume and inscribed with a long count date, which is an absolute count of days from a fixed origin point, and which converts to our calendar with an accuracy of about a day. It is the only writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas that gives us that. When a Maya king put up a stone, he told us the exact date on which he believed he was still the Holy Lord. Which means the archaeology of the Maya collapse is not a matter of inference. It is a matter of counting stones. At the end of the 8th century, roughly 19 or 20 sites across the southern lowlands were dedicating monuments on the Khaldun endings. That is a system in full operation. Kings across a whole civilization, on the same date, performing the same ritual, recording the same claim. Then the number starts falling. By the 830s it is down to a dozen or so. By 859 it is a handful. By 889 there are 3 sites left in the entire Maya world putting up a dated stone. The last securely dated long count monument anywhere is at Tainter, in Chiapas, and it reads to the year 909. After that, silence, not a single dated monument. Ever again. Now here is the detail from inside that sequence that I have not been able to stop thinking about. At a small site called Jimbal, near Tikal, there is a stela dated to 879. It shows the local ruler in the traditional way, surrounded by deity figures, the whole apparatus of divine kingship intact, performed by a minor lord in a shrinking world in the last decades of the system. The next monument at that site, 10 years later, has no king on it at all. The stone is still there, somebody still commissioned it, still paid a carver, still marked the date. But the man who was supposed to be the hinge between earth and heaven has vanished from his own monument. You can watch it happen in a single decade, in stone, at one small town. The apparatus continues. The ritual continues. The date is still recorded. The God King is gone. And what makes this case so valuable is that the physical collapse is not synchronized with it. Some Maya cities were violently ended. At Aguateca, defensive walls were thrown up in a hurry around the turn of the 9th century, made partly of stone robbed from existing buildings, and they did not work. The elite compound was stormed and burned so fast that the inhabitants left their possessions in place, which is a nightmare for the people who lived there and a windfall for archaeology, because it means we have their tools and their pots exactly where they were dropped. But elsewhere the population did not vanish. Millions of Maya people continued living in the region. Their descendants are there now, speaking Mayan languages, about 6 million of them. What ended was not the Maya. What ended was a specific political and religious order, and the thing that ended first, before the burning and before the abandonment, was the credibility of the men at the top of it. There had been drought. The paleoclimate work on lake sediments and speleothems is reasonably consistent that the 9th century included severe multi-year dry periods, and it would be dishonest to leave that out, because it is a real external shock and it matters. But drought is not a sufficient explanation on its own, and here is why. The Maya had been managing drought for 1,000 years. The reservoirs at Tikal, the terracing, the water management systems were all built by that political order, and they were built precisely because dry seasons were normal. The system was designed for this. What the system was not designed for was a king who bled himself in public and the rain did not come, and then bled himself again, and it did not come, and then a third time. The divine claim was falsifiable, and the climate falsified it. That is the cleanest version of the first death anyone will ever find. A legitimacy claim that made a specific checkable promise in front of everyone, and then failed to deliver it in a way that no ritual could explain away. The kings did not stop believing in themselves. They kept putting up stones. Their subjects stopped believing in them, and after that the stones were just rocks, and one day somebody carved one without a king on it because there was no longer any point. The cities were abandoned over the following century. That was the second death. The paperwork. Which brings me back to the room without a quorum, because I have owed you that answer since the beginning. When did Venice die? The Venetian nobility was a closed caste, sealed by a set of measures around 1297 known as the Serrata, the closing, which fixed membership of the Great Council to the male descendants of families already enrolled. That was the whole basis of the Republic. A defined hereditary group, governing collectively, competing for offices, and taking on the enormous personal expense of running a maritime empire because membership of that group was the highest status available to a human being in the Adriatic world. For 400 years it worked, and it worked because the offices were desirable. Then the caste began to shrink, because closed groups do, and because plague and childlessness and the deliberate strategy of limiting marriages to preserve family estates all pulled in the same direction. By the 18th century the patriciate was a fraction of what it had been, and a large proportion of the men who remained on the register were poor. They were called the Barnabotti, after the parish of San Barnaba where many of them lived, and they were noblemen with voting rights and no money, subsidised by the state, available to whoever wanted to buy a block of votes in the Great Council. And the offices stopped being wanted. This is the part that should be famous, and is not. Venice, in its last century, could not get its own aristocracy to accept the magistracies that constituted the Republic. The senior positions were expensive, because holders were expected to fund the dignity of the office themselves, and they carried liability. Men declined them. Men paid fines rather than serve. The Republic had to introduce penalties for refusing office, and had to keep raising them, and by the end it was routinely leaving positions vacant, or filling them with whoever could be persuaded. From 1646, to pay for the war against the Ottomans over Crete, Venice began selling patrician status outright. 100,000 ducats bought a mainland family entry into the aristocracy of the Serene Republic, and over the following decades, more than 100 families bought in. Read that sequence in order. A closed governing caste, whose closure was the entire principle of the state, first cannot get its members to serve, then fines them for refusing, then sells membership to strangers for cash. That is the identical progression as the Theodosian Code, arriving in a different century, in a republic instead of an empire, for exactly the same reason. The honour had become a cost. Compulsion replaced desire, and when the desire is gone, selling the status for money does not reform anything. It liquidates the thing that made the status worth having. When did Venice die then? Not 1797. Somewhere in the 1600s, when the men who were the Republic worked out that being the Republic was a bad deal, and started avoiding it, and the state responded by fining them and then by selling their birthright to whoever had the ducats. By the time Napoleon arrived, there was nothing there to defend, not because the Venetians were cowards, because the entity had been dissolved by its own members, gradually. Through 150 years of individually reasonable decisions, and all that remained was a set of rooms and a costume and a cap. Therefore, we now have 5 cases across 1600 years and 3 continents, with completely different economies, technologies, religions and forms of government, and in every one of them the same sequence appears. Belief goes first. The apparatus continues. The elite defects, either physically or by converting the institution into private advantage. Compulsion replaces consent. And then, at a time and by a mechanism that has almost nothing to do with the original cause, the structure comes down and gets a date in the textbook, at which point an honest person has to stop and ask whether this is a real pattern or whether I have just told you 4 stories with the endings arranged to match. Because that is exactly what a good conspiracy theory looks like, and the field this argument sits in has a track record so bad that it deserves to be treated with suspicion. I want to go through the case against everything I have just said, properly, before I go anywhere near the present day. Start with the strongest rival explanation, which is not a rebuttal so much as a completely different machine that produces the same output. In 1988, an American anthropologist named Joseph Tainter published The Collapse of Complex Societies, and it remains the most rigorous book on this subject that anyone has written. Tainter's argument does not involve belief at all. It is an argument about arithmetic. Societies solve problems by adding complexity. More administrators, more specialists, more infrastructure, more layers of coordination, more information processing. And complexity works. The first increments deliver enormous returns because you are solving the easiest and most valuable problems first. Building a road network in a country with no roads transforms it. Establishing a legal system where there was none is worth an extraordinary amount. But complexity is not free. Every layer has to be fed, in energy, in labour, in taxation, in attention. And because you take the high return problems first, each subsequent layer of complexity delivers less benefit than the one before, while costing at least as much. Eventually, the marginal return on additional complexity goes to 0. Then, it goes negative. At that point, the society is running an apparatus that costs more than it produces, and it is doing so with no reserve, because the reserve was consumed by the apparatus. And then a shock arrives. A drought, an invasion, a plague, a war, something that a healthier society would have absorbed. And instead of absorbing it, the society sheds complexity rapidly, which is what we call collapse. Under Tainter's model, collapse is not a catastrophe. It is a rational economizing response. The people who stopped supporting the Roman order in the 5th century were not suffering from a spiritual failure. They were correctly assessing that the empire had become a bad deal and opting out of a service they were being overcharged for. Notice how completely that explains everything I have shown you, without any reference to legitimacy at all. The decurons were not fleeing because they had lost faith. They were fleeing because the cost of membership exceeded the benefit. The French nobility refused the land tax because they were being asked to fund an apparatus that no longer delivered them anything commensurate. The Soviet second economy grew because the official economy had negative marginal productivity and people routed around it. The Maya kings failed because the water management system had hit its limits. That is a serious, coherent, materialist account, and I am not going to pretend it is weaker than it is. But I think it is incomplete, and the reason is that Tainter's model contains a hidden variable that he does not fully examine, which is the question of who bears the cost and who decides that the deal is bad. Complexity does not present its bill to society as a whole, it presents it to specific people, who then make a judgment about whether to keep paying, and that judgment is not a spreadsheet calculation, it is a judgment about whether the thing they are paying for is theirs. People will pay astonishing costs for institutions they believe are theirs, and refuse trivial ones for institutions they believe are not. That is the entire difference between a war bond and a tax revolt, and the underlying arithmetic can be identical in both cases. The legitimacy account and the complexity account are not competitors. Complexity determines the size of the bill, legitimacy determines whether people pay it. Now the harder objections, and these are the ones aimed at me rather than at the evidence. Objection 1. Declinism has one of the worst predictive records in the history of thought. Oswald Spengler published The Decline of the West in 1918, arguing that Western civilization was in its final winter phase and had roughly 2 centuries left of ossified imperial afterlife. He was enormously influential, and the specific mechanism he proposed has explained nothing that has happened since. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, which opened by stating that the battle to feed all of humanity was over and that hundreds of millions would starve in the 1970s. That is not what happened. Global food production per person rose. In 1972, the Club of Rome published The Limits to Growth, whose more pessimistic runs suggested serious resource-driven breakdown in the early 21st century, and the debate about how the standard run has tracked is still live, but nothing resembling the catastrophic scenarios arrived on the schedule that most readers took away from it. Every generation produces confident people explaining that this time the numbers really are terminal. They have been wrong for at least 2,500 years, since the Egyptian and Mesopotamian scribes complaining that the young no longer respect anything and the world is coming apart. The base rate for civilizational collapse predictions is close to 0, and any argument of this shape has to survive that fact rather than ignore it. Objection 2, and this is the one I find hardest. Survivorship bias, running in reverse. We build the entire theory of collapse out of the societies that collapsed. Rome, the Maya, the Soviet Union, Venice, Bourbon France. What we do not do is systematically examine all the societies that showed the same warning indicators and then did not collapse, because those are not interesting and nobody writes books about them. Britain in the 1840s had mass immiseration, elite panic, an armed insurrectionary movement in the Chartists, famine in Ireland killing 1 million people, and widespread expectation of revolution. It reformed instead. France after 1793 should by any reasonable reading have disintegrated permanently, and instead produced an empire that conquered Europe. The United States in the 1930s had 25% unemployment, armed veterans marching on Washington, serious intellectual defection to both fascism and communism, and it did not collapse. Japan after 1945 had its cities burned, its emperor's divinity publicly revoked by the emperor himself, and total institutional humiliation, and it became one of the most cohesive societies on earth within 20 years. If the indicators fire before collapses, but they also fire before recoveries, then they are not predicting collapse. They are describing stress, and stress is normal. Objection 3. The model is close to unfalsifiable in practice. Any society at any time contains elites who behave selfishly, citizens who evade taxes, institutions that command less deference than they used to, and people who complain that the young do not believe in anything. If you can always find the indicators, then finding them tells you nothing. Peter Turchin's work runs directly into this. Turchin is a population biologist who moved into history and built a quantitative framework he calls cliodynamics, and his structural demographic model tracks 3 variables. Popular immiseration, meaning declining relative living standards for ordinary people. Elite overproduction, meaning that a society produces far more people with elite credentials and elite expectations than there are elite positions, generating a surplus of frustrated and highly capable people who become available for political conflict. And state fiscal weakness, meaning debt and declining capacity. In a piece in Nature in January 2010, he wrote that complex societies are affected by recurrent and predictable waves of political instability, and forecast that the indicators he was tracking look set to peak in the years around 2020. In 2020, he and Jack Goldstone published a piece calling the decade the Turbulent Twenties. You can decide for yourself how that has aged. What you should not do is treat it as vindication, because a prediction of instability in a country the size of the United States over a 10-year window is not a demanding prediction, and a substantial number of historians regard the entire enterprise as pattern matching dressed in equations. That criticism is not stupid. Cliodynamics has to demonstrate out of sample predictive power to be a science, and it has not yet had time to. Objection 4, and this one will matter in about 10 minutes. The modern instruments may not measure what they claim to measure. Trust in institutions surveys are the backbone of every contemporary version of this argument, and they have a serious problem, which is that trust in government tracks which party is in power. In recent United States data, the trust figures for supporters of each party essentially swap places when the presidency changes hands. If your measure of institutional legitimacy inverts every 4 years depending on who won, then a large part of what it is capturing is partisan mood rather than belief in the constitutional order. Add to that the wording problem. Asking whether you trust the government to do what is right is a vague question, and people answer vague questions with whatever they are currently annoyed about. So, 4 serious objections, and I am not going to pretend I have dissolved them. Here is what I think survives them. The declinism objection is about predictions, and I am not making a prediction. Nothing in the historical record licenses anybody to tell you when. Ibn Khaldun's 120-year clock is wrong. Every attempt to put a date on the second death has failed, including by people who correctly identified that the first had happened. The survivorship objection is the strongest, and my honest answer is that it establishes something important, which is that the first death is not necessarily terminal. Britain in the 1840s is a genuine case of a society that reconstituted its legitimacy. It did it through an extraordinary program of institutional reform that was fought for by people who understood exactly what was at stake. That is not a refutation. That is a demonstration that the process is reversible at very high cost, if the people running it can see it. Which leaves the actual claim, which is narrower and considerably harder to dismiss than the one people usually argue about. The claim is not that societies collapse when legitimacy dies. It is that legitimacy death is observable, that it precedes structural failure rather than following it, and that it is systematically invisible to the people living through it. And that last part is the one that matters, because it means the ordinary experience of normality carries no information at all. Every case we have examined felt normal from inside. Venice in 1760, Gaul in 400, Moscow in 1978. Not one of those populations was walking around in a state of dread. They had jobs and gossip and complaints about prices and things they were looking forward to next month. Therefore, the fact that today feels like an ordinary Tuesday is not evidence of anything whatsoever. And now I have to show you the instrument panel, because the same measurements that let us retro-date Rome and France and the Soviet Union are being taken right now continuously by statistical agencies and survey organisations, published openly, and almost nobody reads them as what they are. Start with the longest continuous series anyone has, which is the American one, because the Americans started asking early and never stopped. Since 1958, survey organisations have been asking a version of the same question. How much of the time do you trust the government in Washington to do what is right? In 1958, 73% said always or most of the time. It rose slightly into the mid-60s, peaking around 77% in 1964. Pew's compilation of that series, updated through a survey conducted in September 2025, puts the current figure at 17%, from roughly 3 in 4 to fewer than 1 in 5 over a single human lifetime. And it did not fall in a straight line. It fell in a series of steps, each one associated with something specific. Vietnam and Watergate took out the first and largest chunk, and it never recovered to anywhere near the old level. Stagflation took more. It rallied briefly in the early 2000s after the September 11th attacks, which is what always happens under external threat, and then resumed falling. Now, the caveat I flagged earlier applies with full force. Break that number down by party, and you find that trust among supporters of the party holding the presidency is consistently and dramatically higher than among supporters of the party out of power, and the two lines cross over every time the White House changes hands. In the most recent readings, the gap runs to a factor of 2 or 3. That partisan swing is real, and it means the top-line number is contaminated. But look at what the partisan breakdown actually shows, because I think people draw the wrong conclusion from it. Yes, each side's trust rises when it holds power. The problem is the level it rises to. The winning side's trust now peaks at figures that would once have been considered a crisis. When your own party controls the presidency, and roughly a quarter to a third of your own supporters say they trust the government to do what is right, that is not partisan mood. That is the ceiling having fallen through the floor of the old range. The swing is partisan. The trend is not. Gallup runs a separate annual series on confidence in institutions, and the picture there is the same shape but broader, because it is not about Washington. Confidence in Congress, in the presidency, in the criminal justice system, in newspapers, in television news, in organised religion, in public schools, in big business, has declined substantially across the series, in most cases to record or near record lows. The military and small business remain relatively high. Almost everything else has been eroding for decades. Note what that pattern rules out. If only political institutions were losing confidence, you would call it partisanship. Churches are not partisan in that sense. Newspapers, universities, medicine, the courts and the schools are not all failing for the same political reason. What is declining is not confidence in a party. It is the disposition to extend confidence to institutions at all. Second instrument, tax compliance. Margaret Levi, in a 1988 book called Of Rule and Revenue, gave the concept its name: quasi-voluntary compliance. Almost all tax revenue in a modern state is paid voluntarily, because enforcement capacity is a small fraction of what would be needed to compel a genuinely unwilling population. People pay because they think the state has a right to ask, and because they believe others are paying too. Both conditions are required. The moment a critical mass concludes that the wealthy are not paying, compliance among everyone else degrades, because the norm was never really about the law. That is the exact mechanism that hollowed out the curial class of the Roman Empire, and modern tax authorities measure the outcome directly. It is called the tax gap, the difference between what is legally owed and what is actually collected, and in the United States it runs to several $100 billion annually. Read alongside sustained public attention to how little tax the largest fortunes pay relative to their income, and you have the Salvian complaint reproduced almost word for word. The strong shift the burden onto the weak, and the courts are for sale. Third instrument, and this is the one that gives me the most trouble. The World Values Survey and its relatives have for decades asked a question that sounds naive and is not. If there were a war involving this country, would you be willing to fight for it? A large multi-country survey by the Wynne Gallup International Network, conducted in late 2014 across 64 countries with over 60,000 respondents, found a global average of around 61% saying yes, but the distribution is the finding, not the average. In Japan, 11%. In the Netherlands, 15%. In Germany, 18%. Across Western Europe as a whole, around a quarter. At the other end, Morocco and Fiji above 90, Pakistan and Vietnam approaching 90. More recent polling across NATO members has produced similar figures, with several European members clustering in the mid-20s. Now, there are honest readings of that which are not about legitimacy at all. Countries that have been through catastrophic wars have rationally concluded that fighting them is a bad idea, and the German and Japanese figures are downstream of the 20th century and arguably represent moral progress rather than decay. Some of it is that people in secure countries cannot imagine the scenario. Some of it is that the question is hypothetical and cheap. But hold it next to the Roman case for a second. The Western Empire's fundamental military problem from the 3rd century onward was that it could not get its own citizens to serve. That is why it recruited more and more heavily from outside, why service became hereditary and legally compulsory, why there are laws about men cutting off their own thumbs to avoid the levy. The empire had enormous manpower. What it did not have was willingness. Willingness to fight is the sharpest available proxy for whether people believe the political community they belong to is theirs in a way that outranks their own survival. It is the crudest possible test, and it is the only one that cannot be faked, and in a large part of the developed world it now reads between 1 and 2 people in 10. Whatever else that is, it is a number that would have been unrecognisable to any of these societies at their peak. Add the recruitment data. Several Western militaries, including the United States Armed Services, have missed recruiting targets significantly in recent years, despite substantial bonuses, and the internal analyses point to declining propensity to serve, meaning the proportion of young people who would consider it at all. That is not a labour market problem. Bonuses fix labour market problems. That is Ibn Khaldun's mercenary transition, arriving on schedule in the form of an all-volunteer force that has to bid for participation it used to receive as a matter of course. Fourth instrument. Elite defection in the specific modern form. Turchin's elite overproduction is measurable. Count the number of people acquiring the credentials of elite status, law degrees, doctorates, professional qualifications, and compare it to the number of positions that deliver the life those credentials are understood to promise. In a large number of developed countries, that ratio has been deteriorating for a generation. What you get is a growing population of highly educated, highly capable, deeply frustrated people who have done everything correctly and find the door shut, and who are therefore available for whatever movement offers them a route. Every single case in this script had one. The frustrated provincial lawyers of 1789, the over-educated and underemployed intelligentsia of the late Soviet Union, the Roman curials looking for a way into the imperial service. And at the other end, look at the behaviour of people who have already succeeded. Renunciations of American citizenship, published quarterly, have run at levels an order of magnitude above where they sat 2 decades ago. Residency by investment programs, the golden visas, have become a substantial global industry, selling optionality on jurisdiction to people wealthy enough to buy it. Capital flight indicators and offshore wealth estimates run into the trillions. Buying a second passport is not treason. It is prudent, and I would not blame anybody for doing it. But consider what it means as a signal. It is a wealthy person making a private assessment that the political community they belong to may not be the one worth being tied to, and then paying money to hedge that assessment. That is a Roman senator taking a job at Ravenna. That is a Nomenklatura official quietly working out what the ministry is worth if you own it. It is the same behaviour, expressed in the technology available. And finally, the civic layer, which is where Robert Putnam's work sits. Union membership, church attendance, club membership, local associational life, all of it in long decline. Marriage rates falling, fertility below replacement across almost the entire developed world and in a growing list of middle-income countries. Religious affiliation collapsing, with the unaffiliated now around 1/3 of American adults. I want to be careful here, because this is the point in an argument like this where people start moralising about young people not having babies, and I am not doing that. Fertility decline has many drivers, most of them economic, and most of them individually rational. But the aggregate is not a lifestyle statistic. Every one of those measures tracks the same thing from a different angle, which is the willingness to make a costly, long-horizon, non-reversible commitment to something outside yourself. A marriage, a child, a congregation, a union, an institution. Asabiyyah, in Ibn Khaldun's sense, is precisely the capacity for that kind of commitment, and it is the thing he says dissolves in prosperity and security. Read them all together and the panel is fairly consistent. Trust in institutions in long secular decline across every institution type. Voluntary compliance eroding and visibly conditional on a fairness judgment that is failing. Willingness to defend the political community at levels that would have been considered a crisis in any prior era. Elite credentials outrunning elite positions. Successful people buying exits. Long horizon commitment in retreat across every domain we can measure. If you handed that panel to a historian with no country name attached and asked them which phase of the sequence it corresponds to, I do not think there would be much argument about the answer, and I want to be exact about what that does and does not license, because this is where these arguments always go wrong. It does not tell you that anything is going to collapse. It does not give you a date. It does not even tell you that this is irreversible, because Britain in the 1840s says otherwise. What it tells you is that the instruments which, in every historical case, read this way before the structural failure, are currently reading this way, and that the people who lived through the previous instances found their own lives entirely normal while the instruments read exactly like this. There is one instrument left, the one I have been holding back since the beginning, the signature that shows up in every case in this script, and it is not a survey, and it does not have a margin of error, and you cannot dismiss it as partisan mood, because it is not a measurement of opinion at all. It is a type of law. Every society in this script, in its final phase, started legislating to compel what it had previously received for free. Rome wrote 192 laws to stop its town councillors from running away, then made the obligation hereditary, then tied its tenant farmers to the soil and their children after them, then made military service compulsory and legislated against men who mutilated themselves to avoid it. Bourbon France militarized its tax collection, garrisoned its own salt regions, and filled the galleys with smugglers. The Soviet Union criminalized the failure to work, denied internal passports to tens of millions of farm workers so that they could not legally leave, and required a permit to live in a city. None of those measures were signs of strength. Every one of them was a substitution. In each case, a thing that used to be produced by belief was now being produced by force, and force is enormously more expensive, which is why the substitution accelerates the decline it is trying to arrest. That is the signature. Not the specific law, the substitution. And here is where I have to be careful, because I could make this land harder than the evidence supports. And if I did that, everything I have just spent 2 hours building would deserve to be thrown out. The modern versions are not equivalents. Nobody is binding farm workers to the soil. But look at the shape of the thing rather than its severity. Almost no developed state now trusts its citizens to hand over their income. It takes it at source, before they ever hold it, because voluntary remittance at the scale required stopped being realistic a long time ago. Identity and financial verification requirements have expanded from a niche banking function into a general condition of participating in the economy at all, on the working assumption that any given person may be lying. The United States taxes its citizens on their worldwide income regardless of where they live, one of the very few countries that does, and imposes a specific exit charge on wealthy individuals who renounce their citizenship, which is to say it has written a law that makes leaving the citizen class expensive. The Theodosian Code did that. It is exactly what 192 laws about decurions are for. When people begin exiting a status, you can either make the status worth having again, or you can make the exit costly, and the second option is always cheaper in the short run, and it is always what gets chosen. I am not telling you those policies are wrong. Several of them are defensible on their own terms, and I could argue for some of them myself. I am telling you what they indicate. They indicate a state that has priced in non-compliance. They are the actions of an institution that has already concluded correctly that it cannot rely on being believed. And this is the point where the whole thing turns over, and I have not found a way out of it. Go back to the pattern in the dates. Rome, where every candidate date dissolves into an earlier one, all the way back into the 3rd century. France, where 1789 dissolves into 1786, into 1771, into 1757, into a king who could not perform his own sacrament in 1739. The Soviet Union, where 1991 dissolves into a classified mortality series in 1974 and a frozen official language that stopped meaning anything sometime in the 50s. In every single case, the first death is dated by later historians to a period that the people alive at the time described as stable, not as a crisis, as normality. Roman Gaul in the 400s had markets, schools, dinner parties, careers and complaints about the weather. Versailles in 1770 had the most confident aristocracy in Europe planning gardens. Moscow in 1978 had a space program, a functioning metro, universities, ambitions, and a generation of young people who assumed the world they lived in would outlast them. Because Yurchak's whole point is that it felt eternal right up until it evaporated. Every one of those populations had access to the instruments. The Roman elite could read the laws that were being written about them. The French could count how many people the king had touched, and they were reading the pornography that recorded the answer. The Soviets knew about the second economy because they were in it, and they could see that a whole category of statistics had stopped being published. The information was never hidden. It was published, ignored, and left where anyone could find it. What they could not do was feel it, because there is nothing to feel. The first death does not produce a sensation. It produces a Tuesday. It produces exactly the texture of ordinary life that you are experiencing right now, which is why the fact that everything currently feels ordinary is not evidence that anything is fine. It is not evidence of anything at all. It is the only thing that has ever been reported from inside this condition. Ibn Khaldun understood that. It is the reason he wrote the Muqaddimah as a science rather than a chronicle, because he had already watched one civilization end in Seville and had his family and his teachers taken by plague in a single season, and he had concluded that human beings cannot perceive the state of their own society from inside it, and therefore need instruments. He built the instruments. He put them in a book. Europe did not open it for 400 years, and when it finally did, it treated the book as a curiosity from a dead world rather than a diagnostic manual for its own. That is not an accident of translation. Nobody wants the instrument that reads their own house. And the last thing, the thing I keep coming back to, is that the interval is unbounded. Rome's two deaths were separated by something like a century, depending on where you place the first, and that century contained the entire adult lives of 4 or 5 generations of people who were born after the thing was already over, and who lived and worked and raised children inside an institutional corpse, without ever knowing that is what it was. They were not in decline. They were in Tuesday. Their houses still had tile roofs. Their pottery was still standardized. The courts still functioned, and Boethius could still get a consulship for his sons out of a Gothic king in 522-40, 6 years after the empire had supposedly ended. And if you had told him he was living in the aftermath, he would have looked at you like you were mad. And he would have been entirely reasonable to do so. Venice ran for decades. Bourbon France ran for 50 years. The Soviet Union ran for at least 15, arguably 30. Which means the question that everyone asks about their own society, which is whether it is going to collapse, is the wrong question, and always has been. It assumes the event is in front of you. In every case in the historical record, the event that actually determined the outcome was behind them, and the thing in front of them was consequences arriving at administrative speed. The correct question is not whether it will happen, it is whether it already did, and you are in the interval. And the honest answer is that you cannot know, not because the data is unavailable, but because the only instrument that could tell you what it feels like to be inside the interval is your own sense of normality. And every single population that has ever been inside one has reported that things felt normal. The instruments read the way they read. The trust series has fallen by 2/3 inside one lifetime. Between 1 and 2 people in 10 in some of the wealthiest countries in history say they would defend the political community they belong to. The credentialed and the frustrated are accumulating. The successful are buying exits. The state has stopped expecting to be paid and started taking it at source. And 192 laws about a class of men who would not stay in the offices their grandfathers had begged for are still sitting in the Theodosian Code, in Latin, where anyone can read them exactly as they have been sitting for 1600 years, waiting for somebody to notice what kind of document they actually are. On the 12th of May, 1797, in a room without a quorum, 512 men ended 1100 years of the Venetian Republic, and then went home to lunch. Upstairs, Ludovico Manin took off the horned cap of the Doge and handed it to his servant, and said he would not be needing it again. he was not making a prediction. He was not surrendering, either. He was the last man in Venice to find out something the city had already decided, quietly, without a vote, some time before he was born. He was just the first one to take his hat off.